All right, you're all right. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
It's good to have everybody here this morning and watching on the live stream if you're watching with us this morning. So, if you have your handout, we are on page number 42. And this morning, we're going to be talking about the husband's duty to his wife. All right, we're going to be talking about the husband's duty to his wife. Now, I want to say this. I want to say two things up front before we actually start this lesson. The first thing is that I understand when we talk about these things and there are specific topics like being a good husband, being a good wife, so on and so forth. A lot of times, because it's so specific, people that aren't married or aren't thinking of being married can sometimes feel left out or feel like the information doesn't really jive with them. It's not relevant. But the good thing about this with the husband, and when we get next week into the wife, what makes a good husband is what makes a good leader. So if you're a great husband, you have to be a great leader. If you're a great leader and you're a man, you can be a great husband. And not only if you're a man, but God calls us all, whether man or woman, to be leaders. Whether you know it or not, people look up to you. People, you have an influence as a Christian wherever you are. There is some place where people look up to you, where people, see you as an example to what a Christian should look like. So to be a good leader, honestly, is to be a good Christian. So we're going to see how you can be a good leader, and specifically with the husband, but everyone can take something from this. That's one. Two, and I'm only going to mention this in the beginning, we're going to look at what it takes to be a great leader, what it takes to be a great husband. But we need to understand something, that even if a husband is not being great, even if he's neglecting the things that God has called him to do, no matter what, a wife has to obey her husband. That's just set in stone. That is what it is. The only exception is if your husband is asking you to sin or do something that's outside of what God wants you to do. And that's the case with any authority. We see that in the Bible. People are subject to their authorities, but the only excuse that they have not to obey their authorities is whether or not they're causing them to do something that would have them sin against God. So just want to say that up front, that no matter what, if he's not asking you to sin against God, you have to obey your husband. That is just upfront. That is set in stone. We don't waver from that. That's what the Bible calls us to do and preach. So we're going to preach that how it is. So if you would, turn to Numbers chapter 27. Numbers chapter 27. So a husband's duty to his wife is that he has to love his wife. Right? Everything that he does ought to come from a place of love. It ought to come from a place where he's not blinded by his own self-interest and he's not making a decision based on what makes him feel good, but he's first thinking about how can this benefit my wife? How can this benefit my family? Not only is it how can it benefit myself? Because if you think that way, you're not being a good leader, you're not being a good husband. If you only make decisions to benefit yourself, you're going to fail as a husband, you are going to fail as a leader. That's just step one. So if you look there, letter A, Genesis 2:24, a husband is to cleave unto his wife. So your first blank there in letter A is cleave unto his wife. We are on page number 42. 42. 42. The husband's duty to his wife. Oh, okay. A little overachiever there. My little overachiever there. Yeah. Right. Letter B. Now you're all right. You're all right. I'll keep you in check. Letter B, to love his wife. To love his wife. So your first blank was to cleave unto his wife, and then a husband ought to also love his wife. So first blank is cleave, second blank is love. And then we'll go ahead and fill in letter C's blanks, and then we'll get into Numbers 27. Blank C says, a husband's love for his wife is to be the same as Christ for the church. So your blank in point one under letter C is Christ and church. All right, point two, A husband's love for his wife is to be the same as for their own bodies. All right, so your second blank there is bodies. So point one was Christ for the church, and for point two, for their own bodies. Now, Numbers 27, if you're there, if you will look at verse number 14. So if you have your Bibles open this morning, Numbers 27, we're going to look at verse number 14. And it says this, "For ye rebelled against my commandment in the desert of Zin, and the strife of the congregation to sanctify me at the water before their eyes. That is the water of Meribah and Kadesh in the wilderness of Zin." Now, what's going on here? Why do I bring this up? Well, if you remember, Moses' privilege of going into the promised land is now being revoked. He can't go into the promised land anymore because of what he did in the wilderness, in the water of Meribah. And if you remember what he did, God basically, the people were complaining that they were thirsty. And so what God did was he provided Moses a rock, and he said, hey, just smote this rock, and the waters are going to flow out, and people are going to be able to drink this water. Well, what he did was he smote it twice, right? Instead of one time, he hit it twice, and then the water came out. And then that was an act of rebellion because he was basically not trusting in God that it would only take one smote and the water would come out. Because it was actually the second time that Moses was performing this act. The first time happened in Exodus, and he just did it once, and the waters flowed out, the people drank. This time, he smote it twice. People still drank, but the fact that he did it twice shows that he wasn't trusting God to actually fulfill the needs of the people. And when I would read this story, I would always say to myself that this was harsh. Because if you think about it, Moses, he wasn't perfect, but he did his best. I mean, he kept interceding for the people. He kept saying, God, hold your wrath, don't smite these people. And he was a faithful leader, right, up until this point. And so it always got me why God was so extreme with Moses. Why did he, revoke his privilege to enter the promised land where he was being a faithful leader? And then he had that one point of frustration, that one point of rebellion. And then it was just like, no, like that's it, right? You're not going to be able to enter the promised land. Well, if you look at Psalm 106, because Psalm 106 actually tells us why God was so extreme with Moses. And how him not being able to go into the promised land was actually an act of love. So Psalm 106, verse 32, it says this, "They angered him also at the waters of strife, so that it went ill for Moses," get this, "for their sakes." Verse 33, "Because they provoked his spirit, so that he spake unadvisedly with his lips." So the reason why Moses didn't enter the promised land because of the sin that he committed, which he did commit sin, but the reason why God was so extreme is because Moses literally took the place of the Israelites of having passage into the promised land. Because if you look at verse 32, it said that it went ill for Moses for their sakes. Not because Moses has sinned necessarily, although he did, but it was because if the penalty didn't fall on Moses, it would have fallen on the Israelites. Because what caused Moses to even smote the rock in the first place? Well, it was because the Israelites were complaining. And multiple times when the Israelites would complain, that's when God would threaten to pour out his wrath on the Israelites. And then Moses would intercede on the behalf of the Israelites, and they would be saved. Well, this time they complained, and it almost indicates that if Moses had not taken the blame there, if Moses had not went ill for their sakes, they would have been smited by the wrath of God. That's the only thing you can take from it. I mean, look at it. It said that it went ill with Moses for their sake. So the first act of love that Moses did, his last intercession for the people, was his own life. So think about that. He interceded for the people for years and years and years. And the last intercession that he made for the people cost him his life. And he revoked his own entrance into the promised land so that these people could enter in on his behalf. I mean, that's powerful right there. I mean, when you really think about the depth of Moses, the love of Moses, he was willing to give his own life so that they could have the promised land. I mean, who else does that sound like? That sounds like Jesus, right? That's what Jesus did. Jesus gave his own life for his enemies, not only for the people that loved him, not only for his disciples that followed him, although they forsook him in the end. He gave his life for the very enemies, the very ones that were smiting him, the same ones that were mocking him. He revoked his life. He gave his life and suffered so that they could enter in. It went ill for him for their sakes, just like it went ill for Moses for their sakes. Now, if you look at the next verse, verse number 15, while you're looking at that, I'm going to read Romans 15, verse 1. It says, "We then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak and not to please ourselves. Let every one of us please his neighbor for his good to edification. For even Christ pleased not himself, but as it is written, the reproaches of them that reproached thee fell on me." Now, when it says in Romans 15, verse 1, and we're going to get to the rest of the passage in Numbers 27, but when it says in Romans 15, verse 1, "We then that are strong ought to bear the infirmities of the weak." Now, when you're in a relationship, and it's a man, woman, it's a husband, it's a wife, the Bible often calls the wife the weaker vessel. In 1 Peter 3:7, it says, "Likewise, ye husbands, dwell with them according to knowledge, giving honor unto the wife as unto the weaker vessel." Now, if you look at that in context of Romans 15, that means that as husbands, we ought to bear the infirmities of the weaker vessel, of the weaker person in the relationship, which the Bible calls the wife. As a husband, you should be more mature, you should be more stronger than your wife, according to this passage. That means that when there's a problem, you guys aren't both looking at each other crying, right? Both of you guys can't be crying on the couch, just sobbing about the situation. One of you has to be the bigger person. One of you has to be the one that's like, all right, I see the problem, let's solve it. Or I see you're hurt, let me come for you. But you guys both can't be the same way. That's not how God designed man and woman. You guys are wired differently for that very reason. So we ought to bear the infirmities of the weak. And in verse 3 of Romans 15, "For even Christ pleased not himself." So when you bear the infirmities, don't look at it as a burden. Don't look at it as like, oh, I can't believe I have to do this again. I can't believe there's another problem again. I can't believe I have to solve a problem again and I have to go out of my way to do this. No, you ought not to please yourself. When you're in a relationship, it's no longer about yourself anymore. I mean, think about what it means to be in a relationship, to be married. You both become one flesh. You're both one and the same. So when you're making a decision, you're no longer only making it for yourself, but you're making it for your wife as well. And that's what it means to be a leader. It's making sacrifices when need be for the weaker vessel. Now look at Numbers 27, verse 15. "And Moses spake unto the Lord, saying," now he has just been told he can't go to the promised land. He's been told he's gonna die. He's been told that the people are gonna pass before him. And now look at his response. "And Moses spake unto the Lord, saying, Let the Lord, the God of the spirits of all flesh, set a man over the congregation, which may go out before them, and which may go in before them, and which may lead them out, and which may bring them in, that the congregation of the Lord be not as sheep which have no shepherd." So even though he knows it's over for him, he is going to die, and he's going to go up into the mountain, and he's going to be able to see the promised land but not pass through. Even though he knows all of that, he still says, "But God, just make sure you set someone over them." Like, I know I messed up. I know I'm no longer qualified to be a leader, but make sure that these people have a man that's going to lead them into the promised land, because I can't do it anymore. That's love. I mean, think about that. He knows he's done. It's over for him. And even though he knows he's going to die, he still says, "But God, just make sure that they're okay. Just make sure that they have someone to lead them so that they're not as sheep without a shepherd and they're not scattered." So even though he's suffering for their sakes, he's still looking out for himself. That's the perfect example of what it means to not please yourself, but to truly have a heart for the others, to truly have a heart for other people. That's one of the best examples. The only other example that I could give that even comes close, or actually is above it, but that is in the same realm, is Jesus. There's no other leader that really gives his life the way that Moses did for his people. David's a great leader, but this is on another level. So the first step in being a biblical leader is to love the people that you're leading. And it's to make sure that when you make decisions, you're doing it for the good of the people, not for the good of yourselves. All right, letter D there. Letter D is to provide for his wife. So the blank there in letter D is provide. All right, letter E, to give honor to his wife. And that's 1 Peter 3:7, and we read it when we were talking about the woman being the weaker vessel. So letter E is to give honor to his wife. And letter F, 1 Corinthians 7:3 says, let the husband render unto the wife due benevolence, and likewise also the wife unto the husband. So your blank there for letter F is to render due benevolence to his wife. All right, so if you're there in Numbers, if you would turn forward to Esther, the book of Esther, chapter 1. Esther, chapter number 1. So we see that not only is it important to love your wife, not only is it important to love the people that you're leading and to put their needs before yours, and to make sure that if it comes down to it, you're the one that makes a sacrifice for them. And if anyone's going to suffer hurt, it's got to be you, so that they can live the way that you would want them to, so they can be privileged to rest on your afflictions. But not only loving them, but the second thing that a good leader does is that he respects them. All right, so we love them, and the second thing is to respect them. Now, if you're there in Esther chapter 1, Esther chapter 1, go ahead and look at verse 5. And when these days were expired, this is Ahasuerus, the king of Persia at this time. And when these days were expired, the king made a feast unto all the people that were present in Shushan the palace, both unto great and small, 7 days in the court of the garden of the king's palace, where were white, green, and blue hangings fastened with cords of fine linen, and purple and silver rings and pillars of marble. The beds were of gold and silver, upon a pavement of red and blue and white and black and marble. And they gave them drink in vessels of gold, the vessels being diverse one from another, and royal wine in abundance, according to the state of the king. And the drinking was according to the law, none did compel, for so the king had appointed to all the officers of his house, that they should do according to every man's pleasure. Verse 9. Also Vashti the queen made a feast for the woman in the royal house which belonged to King Ahasuerus. On the 7th day, when the heart of the king was merry with wine, he commanded Mehum, Biztha, Arbana, Bigtha, and Abagatha, Sether, and Carcas, the 7 chamberlains that served in the presence of Ahasuerus the king, to bring Vashti the queen before the king with the crown royal, to shew the people and her princes her beauty, for she was fair to look on. And we'll end it here, verse 12. But the queen refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Now, there was a couple of things that King Ahasuerus did wrong in this scenario. But also Vashti did wrong as well. Because when the king commanded her, when her husband commanded her to come, she was disobedient because of the way that he was treating her. Now, you could see how she would feel that way because of the things that he did. But like we said in the beginning, no matter what, unless he's asking you to sin, you have to obey your husband. So Vashti is in the wrong here too. But what I really want to focus on are the faults of King Ahasuerus in this section. So the first thing that he does is he neglects his wife, right? There's been a long period of time where he has not seen his wife at all, right? He's not giving her attention. He's not being there with her. And so therefore there's some animosity that's developing between the king and the queen. And not only that, when he wants her to come to him, it's only to show her off. It's not even to go and, be with her or to talk with her, to show her how much he loves her. It's just to use her as an object. And if you look there in your handout, and at letter F, we filled this out, but it says right there in the parentheses, do not use her as an object of personal pleasure. All right. And that is exactly what King Ahasuerus was doing. He was only using her to boost himself up and to bring pleasure to the people that were looking upon her because she was very beautiful. So the first thing that he does is he doesn't give her attention. There's many days and many months where he doesn't see her. The second thing that he does is that when he calls her, is only to treat her as an object, not as a person, just because she was beautiful to look on. But then the third thing that he does, and this is what we're going to focus on, verse 12, therefore the king was very wroth, and his anger burned in him. Now, when dealing with conflict, especially in marriage, divorce should never be threatened. But rather, the Bible says some steps to take when you're dealing with conflict. So the Bible has a perfect plan laid out in terms of conflict resolution. All right. If you would turn to James 1. All right, James 1. We're going to go through this quickly, and then we'll finish up with the last couple of links there. James 1. Verse number 19. All right, James 1:19. Wherefore, my beloved brethren, let every man be swift to hear, slow to speak, slow to wrath. For the wrath of man worketh not the righteousness of God. So the first step when you're dealing with conflict, either with other people, with your wife, or just, the people that you're leading, that you're managing, that are following you, is to not be overtaken with emotion. You do not want emotion to dictate how you respond to a situation. You ought to slow down, you ought to think about it, and then based on the information that you gather, make a response according to knowledge, not according to emotion. If you see there in James 1, it says, let every man be swift to hear, hearing the situation out, slow to speak, don't just jump the gun and say something that you're going to regret, and then slow to wrath, all right? Which is not to be overcome with emotion. Proverbs 18 verse 13 says, he that answereth a matter before he heareth it, it is folly and shame unto him. So if you are answering a matter before you have fully heard it out, the Bible calls you a fool. Because usually when people are answering a matter before they hear it, they're just jumping the gun and they're reacting off of emotion. So if you just are all caught up in your emotions and you only hear what is triggering your anger, Bible calls you a fool. And there's shame on you because you're not hearing the whole spectrum of the situation. So first step is don't be overtaken with emotion. Second step is make sure you hear her out before making assumptions. And when you do answer, make sure it's according to knowledge, according to 1 Peter 3:7. And then 3, resolve it in a timely manner. All right. Don't hold grudges. You see, the Bible gives us a time frame of when we should resolve issues. So in Ephesians 4, verse 26, it says this, be angry and sin not. Let not the sun go down upon your wrath. Neither give place to the devil. So the Bible is saying you should not go to bed angry, right? You should resolve the issue before you start the next day. Now, of course, it's not always possible with certain situations. Obviously, the world is not black and white. So there are some situations, some very serious situations that people can go through in life, some very serious arguments that people can go through in life. And sometimes it's not like, all right, we're about to go to bed. We have to make sure that we solve this or else we're sinning. That's not the case. Because the case here is let not the sun go down upon your wrath, not upon your anger. All right. Because it says be angry, but sin not. What does it look like to sin? Well, it's letting the sun go down upon your wrath. So if you're wrathful, which is a step up to anger, and you go to bed in that state, that's a sin. You don't not be like that. Either you resolve it in that timely manner, or you calm yourself down enough so that it doesn't bleed into the next day and the problem doesn't snowball into a bigger problem. All right, so step 3 is resolve it in a timely manner. And the last thing before we wrap it up this morning is don't involve others. Okay, do not involve others. And get this, especially your family. All right, and this is why I say that. All right, when you involve your family, usually your family is always going to see it from your point of view. Your family is usually going to see it from the point of view that you are giving them. Now, there are parents out there that can see it in an objective sense. There are some parents that, their Bible is the foundation, and they're able to look at your situation and his situation, or vice versa, and say, all right, this is what you should do, right? Some parents have the integrity to say, hey, you know what? Actually, you're wrong, and this person's right. And obviously, there are very extreme situations where you have to go to somebody. Right. So I'm not talking about something where your life is in danger or there's something that's going to totally ruin your life or uproot your life. But Proverbs 17 verse 9 says this: he that covereth a transgression seeketh love, but he that repeateth a matter separateth very friends. So you could take 2 things from this. One, do not repeat it to anybody else. If you have an issue with somebody, make sure you resolve it with them, the person that you have a problem with. And that could be with your spouse, that could be with your significant other, that could be with a friend, right? The first thing that is in church discipline in Matthew 18, Jesus commands people to go to that brother that has offended you and first try to resolve it with him. And if he doesn't hearken unto you, then get 2 or 3 witnesses. If they won't hearken, if you can't resolve the issue, make sure you bring the whole church involved. But the first step to conflict resolution is going to that person and that person alone, right? Not to Facebook, not to Instagram, not to your friends, not even to your family. You ought to make sure that if you have an issue with somebody, you're going to them first. You're not spreading rumors. You're not going to this person trying to, develop this coup. It ought to be between you and that person alone. Because he that repeateth matter separateth very friends. And now this is the second thing we can take from this, is if something has been resolved, and you were able to solve the problem with that person, don't keep bringing it up. Don't keep throwing it in their face. Don't do it. Why are you going to do that? You solved the situation, so don't keep bringing up the past and using that as artillery to make them angry, to get a reaction out of them. Or the next time that there's an argument, you bring up the past as ammo. You ought not to do that. He that repeateth a matter separateth very friends. If you have resolved it, leave it in the past. Don't bring it back up. Whether it's to that person or to the people around you, your family, your friends. Don't go spreading rumors about the people that you love. Don't do it. If it's in the past, let it be there in the past. All right, so last point. So not only should we love the people that we lead, not only should we respect and resolve conflicts with the person that we lead, but the second thing is that we ought to have integrity when we're a leader. We ought to have integrity when we're a leader. If you would, turn to Matthew 23. Matthew chapter 23. If you're there in Matthew 23, the last blank, or the second to last blank, is to defraud not his wife. All right, so letter G is defraud. And then letter H, the husband is to be the head of the wife and the home. So letter H is head. If you're there in Matthew 23, verse 2, Jesus is talking to the Pharisees and scribes, And he says this, saying, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. All therefore whatsoever they bid you observe, that observe and do, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. For they bind heavy burdens and grievous to be borne, and lay them on men's shoulders, but they themselves will not move them with one of their fingers. One of the greatest things, and this, I believe this is the foundation to leadership. This is the foundation to being a good husband, a friend, whatever it is that integrity means more than the title. Integrity means more than the status that you've been given. Because look what Jesus says here in Matthew 23. He says, all therefore whatsoever they bid you and observe, that observe and do. Why is that? Because in the previous verse, he said, the scribes and the Pharisees sit in Moses' seat. So because of their status, because of their title, listen, you gotta observe and do what they preach. Because what they're doing is they're preaching the law of Moses. All right, and Moses, that's my word, so you ought to obey that, no matter who's preaching it. And because they're in Moses' seat, that seat there is a place of authority. They're sitting in a place of authority that because of that, you have to observe and obey what they say, because they're speaking out of the law of Moses, and they're in the position that Moses would have been in. But in verse 3, it says, but do not ye after their works, for they say and do not. You see, what's more important than just being a husband, what's more important than just being a manager, what's more important than just being a leader and just holding that title close to your chest is actually acting like one, is actually having the integrity where people respect you and not just your status, not just your title. Because that can only go so far, right? You can only call yourself the man of the house so many times. You can only call yourself the manager so many times. And people have to obey you no matter what. They have to. But their heart won't be with you. Because you're saying one thing, but you're doing another. You're telling them to do something when you yourself are not doing the very thing that you're commanding them to do. You're going to lose their heart. They're not going to want to follow you. And you're going to end up having a broken home. You're going to end up having a broken job. And you're going to having broken friends. Why? Because you're being a hypocrite. And God hates hypocrites. God hates people that do something and say something, but behind closed doors, they're totally different. That's not respectable at all. And honestly, Proverbs 20 verse 7 says this, the just man walketh in his integrity, his children are blessed after him. So the just man walketh his integrity, and notice this, his children are blessed after him. So because a husband is blessed, is walking in his integrity, the children are going to respect that. Children are going to respect that. So, that's the thing, is that if you do something at home and the children are seeing that, they're not going to respect you. Right? They're going to respect you when dad is acting one way at church and he's acting a totally different way at home. Or whatever the situation is. If they see you doing something in this place and they see you doing another thing at that place, that's hypocrite. They pick up on those things. And if you walk in your integrity, however, your children are going to be blessed because they're actually going to listen and take heed to what you say. Now, last passage we're going to turn to, we ran out of time. But Genesis 19, this is the last passage, and then we'll close in prayer. Genesis chapter 19. All right, Genesis 19, this is obviously in Sodom and Gomorrah, and this is Lot in Sodom and in Gomorrah. And basically the angels are trying to take him out because God's about to rain hellfire on the city and destroy it. Now, I want you to notice what ends up happening to Lot's family during this period. So Genesis 19, verse 14, it says, and Lot went out and spake unto his sons-in-law, which married his daughters, and said, up, get you up out of this place, for the Lord will destroy the city. But he seemed as one that mocked unto his sons-in-law. So guess what? They're not taking him serious. They're saying, Lot, like, you're joking, Lot. Like, you're playing with me, Lot. We know you, Lot. Lot, you've been here in Sodom and Gomorrah with us. You haven't been leading your family. You haven't been practicing the integrity that you are now trying to infuse on us. What, God's going to bring hellfire? You haven't talked about God once, Lot. So what are they saying here? They're saying, hey, Lot, you know what? I'm not taking you serious. You're one that's mocking right now. Because what Lot was doing is that he was in one of the worst places in the world right now. And it seems like he wasn't rebuking any of them. He wasn't saying anything to them. He was just going along with the flow. Not to say he was a sodomite, because he was a just man. But he was there in sin, in a city of sin, and he was not against it enough where people would take him serious when he actually said a warning concerning the city that he was in. So they're not taking him serious. Why? Because Lot did not have integrity. Lot did not do what needed to be done as a husband, as a leader in the home, which is to stand against sin and actually practice what you preach. So when he actually says something, they don't believe him. They mock him. They make fun of him. All right, verse 15. And when the morning arose, then the angels hastened Lot, saying, Arise, take thy wife and thy 2 daughters, which are here, lest thou be consumed in the iniquity of the city. And while he lingered, the men laid hold upon his hand, and upon the hand of his wife, and upon the hand of his 2 daughters, the Lord being merciful unto him, and they brought him forth, and set him without the city. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and Gomorrah, as verse 24. Then the Lord rained upon Sodom and upon Gomorrah brimstone and fire from the Lord out of heaven. And he overthrew those cities and all the plain, and all the inhabitants of the cities, and that which he grew upon the ground. So his son-in-laws are done. They've been killed, right? So at this point, he's lost his son-in-law because they thought that he was just playing with them. He thought he was just mocking. Lot didn't have integrity to actually back up the warnings that he was giving them. Verse 26, now he loses his wife. But his wife looked back from behind him, and she became a pillar of salt. So now he loses his wife. Why? Because the same exact reason. You see, she obeyed him, right? She followed him because that's what she needed to do. As a husband, your wife has to follow you no matter what. We said that in the beginning. But the thing that I want to point out here is even though she was following him, her heart was not with him. Her heart was not fully committed to what he was doing. Why? Because Lot did not have integrity to impose those things. And that's why God makes this claim multiple times that integrity is more important than status. Because anyone can be a husband. Anyone can be a father. Anyone can be a leader and put themselves in that position. But what makes you valuable is actually having the integrity to back that up. So he lost his wife. Verse number 30. And Lot went up out of Zoar and dwelt in the mountain, and his 2 daughters with him, for he feared to dwell in Zoar. And he dwelt in a cave, he and his 2 daughters. And the firstborn said unto the younger, Our father is old, and there is not a man in the earth to come in unto us after the manner of all the earth. Come, let us make our father drink wine, and we will lie with him, that we may preserve seed out of our father. Now, I won't read the rest, but basically, they end up committing incest, and, they bear children. Now, what all these issues represent is that Lot's wife is gone. She's a pillar of salt. And in a way, he's lost his daughters as well. Why? Because they become influenced with the sin that they were surrounded by. Think about it like this. Genesis 19, what were they trying to do to the people that were in the house? Right? They were trying to abuse them sexually. And so it's no coincidence that that's exactly what Lot's daughters are doing to Lot. Right? So it's almost like the people in Sodom and Gomorrah didn't get Lot like they wanted to, but later on his daughters did. He didn't fully escape because his daughters made him get drunk, and they did what she did to them in a cave. So here's the thing. Do not allow the enemy to influence due to your lack of influence. Because any space where you're not influencing your family, any space where you're not influencing the ones that you lead, the enemy will come in and he'll take the reins and say, okay, let me take over. If you're not doing the job, if you're not influencing them, if you're not filling that space and you're neglecting that space, that opening, the devil, the enemy is going to come in. He's going to influence your family, and he's going to do what you failed to do, which is walk in integrity and have the power to influence your people. So we looked at the 3 things that make a biblical leader. First is to love them, is to respect them, resolve conflicts within those 2 people that you have an issue with. And then the third thing is to make sure that you have integrity and that the integrity is backing up the status that you've been given. All right, let's pray. Heavenly Father, Lord, thank you, Lord, for this study. Lord, thank you, Lord, for your word, God. And I pray that everyone here, God, would take heed to these words, Lord. And that even though, everyone might not be married, Lord, or heading into marriage, God, I would pray that they would realize that, to be a great leader, God, is something that you've called all of us to do. And I pray, Lord, that they would see these 3 steps, Lord, and that they will learn from the mistakes of people that have made mistakes in the Bible. And I pray, God, that everyone here would lead in love, lead in respect, Lord, and lead in integrity. We love you, Lord, and we praise you, Lord. Please be with Brother Anthony, Lord, as he preaches, Lord. Fill him with your spirit, and be with everyone as they come.